So I'm Melanie Crofts, and I'm a law lecturer, since we're inundated with law lecturers here at the Montfort. This is my colleague Lucy.
I'm Lucy Ansley, and I'm the Research Fellow for the Freedom to Achieve project, which we'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment, so spoilers, I won't tell you now.
And just to note that as well as being a lecturer, I'm seconded 0.5 of my contract to the Freedom to Achieve project, which has also been extended for a couple of years, which again we'll perhaps mention in a minute. So I'm not going to spend too much time on background, because my colleagues in previous papers have done this in quite a lot of detail. We too would also question the use of the term BAME and it not being a homogenous group, and perhaps thinking about using other types of terminology to describe a group of students who are not homogenous, but obviously the term BAME is very often used in research and in terms of looking at data. So sometimes we refer to the term BAME, but we would prefer to use students of colour or racialised minorities. In terms of what we're considering in student experiences, there have been a lot of reports and research into student experiences of race and racism in higher education. And we think it's important to consider issues such as the cumulative effect of microaggressions that feed into the experience of how students experience racism in higher education. However, stereotypes and racialised assumptions can often form part of these microaggressions, and they have also got a part to play in the deficit model, which has also been mentioned by colleagues in previous papers. So there has been quite a lot of focus recently on issues around decolonising the curriculum, and we'll have a look at that again in a minute. Quite a lot is being said about this as a means to addressing what has been termed as the BAME attainment gap. Although this is part of it, this can only be one element to addressing the attainment gap. And we would argue that there has to be a holistic approach that is needed, which focuses on institutional racism, so looking at structures and processes within institutions to address institutional racism. Decolonising the curriculum might be one element of that, but on its own is not sufficient. And as colleagues have also highlighted, we need to move away from deficit model thinking. One reason that the issue around deficit model has come up is from my own experience of teaching, where I've had colleagues say things like, oh, well, you know, it's cultural. They don't have the confidence, or it's a lack of understanding of what higher education is about. Now, those factors may play into issues around what we expect what higher education looks like in terms of very white privileged structures. And therefore, of course, those expectations are not going to be met because we have a very set view of what higher education is, and if you don't fit within that then creates that deficit model thinking and discussions that the problem lies with the student and not with the white hierarchical structures that we have within higher education. Again, we've highlighted the attainment gap, and various colleagues have done this in terms of discussion, and again we would prefer to use the term differential degree awarding, which again places the emphasis not on the student is underachieving, but actually it's something that institutions are doing, which means that students are not being awarded the same as their white counterparts. So focus again, I think, in terms of terminology, moving it away from the student and placing the emphasis on the institution. So we've already highlighted the national picture. At DMU currently, the differential degree awarding statistic is 8.9% at DMU. And students of colour make up approximately 56% of DMU, so we can see the context in which we're operating. I think I might just copy the slide. And quite a lot of what we're doing in terms of our work is framed by critical race theory, and I thought this quote was quite a nice little quote in terms of critical race theory, which is a body of scholarship steeped in radical activism that seeks to explore and challenge the prevalence of racial inequality in society. It is based on the understanding that race and racism are the product of social thought and power relations. Critical race theorists endeavour to expose the way in which racial inequality is maintained through the operation of structures and assumptions that appear normal and unremarkable. And I think the work that Freedom to Achieve is trying to do at Montfort is very much framed in this context and looking at issues around critical race theory. And again, moving away from deficit model thinking to looking at the structures and assumptions that appear normal within a higher educational institution. Very quickly, for those people who aren't familiar with critical race theory advocates race as being the primary mode of oppression, although it does recognise that race intersects with other areas such as gender and disability. Two main concepts are around interest convergence and contradicting closing cases. Interest convergence is where the interests of white people and people from racialised minorities or people of colour coincide, which means that you get the momentum to possibly make changes. Contradiction closing cases are potentially where interest convergence occurs. So in the UK, very often Macpherson and the Stephen Lawrence situation is given as an example of a contradicting closing case, where inequalities have become so bad that it culminates in an event which then means that things have to progress in terms of race equality. But those progressions are then generally wound back quite quickly following that event. The other thing that is really important in critical race theory and links to what Lucy's going to say in terms of what we're doing at DMU is the importance of narratives and the voices of oppressed minorities. And these are really, really important in terms of critical race theory issues.
So that links in nicely with where we're going next. But I am actually going to go slightly off piece and tell you what Freedom to Achieve is first, just because I realise we keep talking about it, but we haven't actually explained what we do. Essentially, Freedom to Achieve is DMU's response to the attainment gap or to differential degree awarding. It's a project that we joined, led by Kingston University, working alongside colleagues at the University of Hertfordshire, the University of Greenwich, UCL and Wolverhampton. And the kind of main elements of the project were around us using a data set that they call the value-added metric, which essentially accounts for kind of past qualifications and helps to move the conversation away from that deficit model thinking on student attainment. And also around an inclusive curriculum framework, which here at DMU we embedded into Universal Design for Learning. And as part of our work on the project, we worked with 40 pilot programmes, 10 per each of our 4 faculties. And co-creation and student voice was really at the heart of that work. And then going back to the previous slide kind of gives into why that was, why we really wanted student voice to be the core of that work. So I joined the project in January 2018. The project had been running for around a year at that point, and I come from a qualitative research background. So a lot of the evaluation that we'd been asked to do as part of the work with Kingston was looking at measuring the attainment gap. And we were really keen, the team, as a project team, to make sure that we include those more qualitative elements, to make sure that we're bringing it back to the fact that when we look at the attainment gap and we look at that data and those figures, what we're looking at is people's lives and we're looking at people's experiences in the institution. So it's important to make sure we have that qualitative element alongside and we can look at how students are experiencing their time here on campus. And what a critical race-grounded methodology allows us to do, using grounded theory and the way that it treats theory as emergent, so you don't go into the field with assumptions about how things are, which particularly for myself as a white researcher, it's not my place to go into those communities and have a theory about how their experiences are formed, but instead to listen to their voice, to listen to their experience and to use that to generate theory around what's actually happening here at DMU. And again, there's those elements of reflexivity that allow us as researchers to then consider how our interactions in those spaces affect the data that we're collecting. So we conducted some co-creation events with students, which has been mentioned before, that we did one with the Law Society as well. And in total we worked with 310 students. So these were largely second-year students, largely female, and when we talk about students in those larger category terms, largely students of colour. But I also wanted to include a breakdown of the student groups, so we can look at that more in terms of specific ethnicities, so you can see that white students were still the overall majority when we break it down into specific ethnic groups. And you can see we also have a large representation from the Black African community and from Asian communities. These do generally reflect the population at DMU, but it was just interesting to include that and to not purely talk about students of colour as a kind of umbrella. So you can see there's a mix there of voices. So in terms of what we learned from those discussions, we spoke to students about 4 particular themes that had arisen from research in the area and from early conversations with students on campus. And those were teaching and learning, their sense of community, their opportunities for development, and their relationships with staff and with other students. And a couple of findings came out of that. So these are some of the core areas. There was more, but we don't have time to go through everything, so we talked about a lot. So these are some of the key things that came up. So the most common discussion was around student integration. So 86% of all the sessions we held, students talked about student integration, and in particular about a lack of student integration. So they talked about this in terms of integration between ethnic groups, but also in terms of between students from different subject areas, between different year groups. But it was primarily around ethnic groups and in their integration. And in particular, students talked about feeling like they had no way to make friends. They didn't know how to start those conversations with students from other backgrounds and how to build a relationship. And they talked about the fact that they receive an academic induction when they come to university, but they don't really receive a social induction. We're not necessarily, depending on the backgrounds that we've come from, used to engaging with people from different backgrounds, and there's not that kind of support initially encouraging students to engage with one another. And that's something that we can consider as we move forward as a project. Students also talked about staff and student relationships, as well as relationships with their peers. And they talked about approachability, largely. They were very aware of when they perceived staff to be approachable, someone that they could relate to and someone that they could talk to, or conversely when staff weren't viewed as approachable, and how that meant that they often didn't then engage in those tutorials or in those lessons. Particularly of interest was when students talked about when they'd learned about staff backgrounds, regardless of ethnicity, when they'd learned about how those members of staff had come to their role, their career paths and their journeys, and that really helped them to find other ways that they could relate to those members of staff. And so their perception of their approachability increased because they just knew a little bit more about their lecturers as people and their backgrounds. They also talked about placements in terms of a lack of access, and students of colour specifically noted that they felt that they were less able to access resources through placements than their white peers. They didn't give explanations as to why that was, but they highlighted that was a concern for them. And this was in hand with conversations around white spaces in relation to particular support opportunities in the university. And they also talked about how kind of generic support might be. So Isaac made mention of that earlier, that sometimes the support's just too generic and it doesn't actually help you in your situation. And so this meant that students didn't feel that they were getting what they needed from placements. And they also talked about barriers to placement. So when they had other jobs outside of university that they'd have to try and match a placement with, when they had care responsibilities outside of university, and also the duration of placements. A lot of students talked about wishing that they could do shorter term placements so they could get some experience, but they didn't have to take a whole year out from their studies to do so. They also talked a lot around role models, again around a lack of role models for students of colour. But interestingly, they talked about the fact that they really wanted to see more senior students, so second and third years and postgraduate students, and alumni as role models in the university. They wanted to link up with students who were, a year or two ahead of them, because they felt that was someone they could really relate to and someone that could give them advice on how they can progress and they can succeed. And then lastly, they talked about cultural inclusivity. So this was around curriculum content and around the sense that they felt reflected by their curriculum content. And again, students also talked about how much they valued seeing staff reflect on their own backgrounds within their curriculum content. Again, kind of increasing that relatability of staff and improving relationships. Which I think is kind of the core message of what we wanted to talk about in today's session, was about the fact that relationships was one of the core things that came out of the discussions with students. And when a lot of the approaches to addressing the attainment gap are looking at the curriculum, we need to broaden our view and think about how we can support students in feeling a greater sense of belonging, not just in the classroom but on campus as a whole. And that really came through in the discussions that we've had with students.
And I think that links in quite nicely to what Malika, Victoria and Liam were saying around issues to do with hearing, views and opinions being affected, that building that sense of belonging, and that's why something like the Black Student Law Society is something that could facilitate that sense of belonging. So again, a nice little link in there. And what I just wanted to do here is link all of this to issues of pedagogy. So thinking about a sense of belonging and what that means to students of colour, facilitating empowerment and emancipatory pedagogy. So what we do within our classroom can also mean that we can build that sense of belonging, those relationships, and think about what some of those students have said about the campus generally, but bringing that within our own pedagogic practices. So thinking about critical pedagogy, pedagogy of the oppressed, critical race pedagogy, as has been articulated by people like Freire, Apple, Bell Hooks, and others. The other issue is around discussing and not being afraid to discuss race, racism and white supremacy within this context. So again, we heard in the keynote from Silhouette this morning about not kind of de-racialising education. So we need to think about this and how we bring in a critical analysis of whiteness, again, into our classrooms and the way that we manage our classes. And that's also reflective of what we do more broadly outside of our classrooms and the institution. So it does link to inclusive curriculum and decolonising. I mean, obviously that's part of it, and that might be reflected in the facilitating of the empowerment and emancipatory pedagogies, and it may be part of that, but we also need to think more broadly than just inclusive curriculum, as Lucy has highlighted. Actually, that sense of belonging, those relationships are really quite significant. And also, as I've mentioned, around critical race theory and around critical race grounded methodology, those narrative methods are really important, involving students of colour and moving beyond the curriculum, but listening to what students of colour have to say about their experiences within higher education and taking note of those, and it just not being a tick box exercise in terms of what we then do with that information to move things forward. The other question that I would highlight is about who owns knowledge. So again, thinking about, and I would perhaps challenge some of Savannah's issues that she raised around, teaching students about what we mean by, what is an essay, how do we do academic writing, that kind of thing. But actually, well, maybe we need to change the way that we're teaching assessing in the classroom so that students' knowledge, what they bring to the classroom, is more important. Maybe we should think about, do we need to have traditional essays that use Harvard or Scholar referencing as the norm? Can we assess, can we look at knowledge in a different way? Does it always have to be linked to issues around assessment? And this real issue about silencing of students of colour, which links in again to what Malika was saying about listening to students and their opinions. And in everything that we're doing in terms of co-creation, seeing students as active partners. But there is a balance to be had in relation to this, because obviously, if we're relying on students of colour, staff of colour to be doing this work, what is the reward? What is the recompense? How do we recognise that involvement? Because it's training. So I'm told, to be constantly having to be involved in these things and not getting any recognition for that. And being relied upon to be providing the answers. Actually, we need to have a balance in relation to how we deal with that. So just in terms of some takeaway issues, thinking about having a holistic institutional approach, thinking about the sense of belonging, what we do in the classroom as well as what we do outside. I don't know whether you want to mention about the decolonising DMU.
Yep, so as a project, we are moving forward for a further 2 years, and we are currently discussing how we might rebrand our project. I'm sure that all of you in the room, when you saw that we're Freedom to Achieve, had no idea what that's about. And you wouldn't be the only ones. So we're trying to look at how we can be more explicit about what it is that we do. Or as our project director likes to put it, how we pass the Ron Seal test. So we're currently looking into moving towards terminology more around decolonising DMU, so we can be more upfront about what we're aiming to achieve as a project. And the idea behind this will be that we're looking at more than just the curriculum, which is why it's not decolonising the curriculum at DMU. We're looking at how we address the wider issue of belonging for all students on campus.
And then, just because I know we're running out of time, we've highlighted the importance. Highlighting the importance of including students in the conversation, but actually, how do we support student-led activism? How do we get students involved and support that in terms of moving things forward? And also encouraging staff activism. So it's all very well talking about these things, but what are we going to do? How are we going to implement this in our own classrooms, in our own circumstances, to really kind of drive this forward?
Yeah. I think as Silhouette said this morning, when do we get to the happening?
Yeah.
Thank you.